The joke didn't start loud. It rolled out as a tired, gravelly chuckle from the back corner of a dim briefing chamber buried deep within a Soviet military complex outside Moscow. It was late 1970s, an era when cigarette smoke clung to every uniform and maps of Western Europe were covered in thick red arrows confidently pushing toward the Rhine. At the front of the room, a grainy projection flickered against the wall, a schematic of an American prototype tank engine. Most of the men present had spent decades elbow-deep in oil and steel, and they squinted at the image with a kind of casual contempt. A colonel with the posture of a man fused permanently to his chair tapped the screen with an old wooden pointer. "Comrades, the Americans are installing an aircraft turbine into a tank." The corner of his lips curled as if he couldn't help himself. A ripple of laughter followed. A decorated general near the head of the table took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing like a lazy star. "An aircraft engine?" he repeated, blowing out a cloud of blue haze. "What do they plan to do? Hop over the Fulda Gap?" No one in the room felt threatened. If anything, they felt reassured. The schematic displayed the projected weight of the American XM1 project, over 55 tons before armor packages. Some predicted it would push 60, maybe more. The Soviet colonel began listing comparisons with the calm cruelty of a man sharpening a knife. T-64, 36 tons. T-72, barely over 40. And this American glutton? Heavy, oversized, and, according to them, utterly impractical. The colonel shook his head, amused. "It will drown in the first muddy field it enters. And maintenance." He didn't need to elaborate. The room already knew what he meant. A complex, turbine-powered machine? It sounded like a logistical disaster waiting to happen. To the Soviet doctrine of the 1970s, tanks were not supposed to be marvels of engineering. They were tools, simple, deadly, easy to manufacture by the thousands. The T-72 embodied this philosophy perfectly. Compact, rugged, low silhouette, built around a brutally efficient autoloader that replaced the fourth crewman. It was the hammer of a future armored tidal wave meant to crash through NATO lines. So, when the Americans unveiled a tank that seemed to embrace complexity, digital electronics, and turbine technology, the Soviets didn't see a revolution. They saw decadence, waste, a parade queen made for American generals, not for real war. What none of the laughing men realized was this. The joke they were enjoying so much was the greatest misread of their careers. The reports that trickled into Moscow over the next few years only reinforced the confidence born in that smoky briefing room. GRU analysts, engineers, and veteran officers pored over every scrap of intelligence on America's new tank program, and every piece seemed to confirm what they already believed. The XM1 was an overfed, over-engineered experiment destined to fail in any real fight. From their perspective, the American approach made no sense. Their own history had taught them that complexity was the enemy of reliability. The great German cats of World War II, the Tiger and Panther, had been armored juggernauts, yes, but also mechanical nightmares. Meanwhile, the humble Soviet T-34, rough as a farm tool and twice as stubborn, had rolled off production lines in endless numbers and crushed the German war machine by weight of quantity and simplicity. The T-72 carried that heritage forward. It was built low, fast, and cheap. Its autoloader meant one less crewman to train. Its 125mm gun hit hard and hit often. A T-72 could be repaired with basic tools and field ingenuity. It didn't need fragile electronics or specialized technicians. It was the perfect instrument for the Soviet doctrine of massed armored thrusts. Steel avalanches meant to shatter NATO's defenses with brute momentum. So why, the Soviets wondered, were the Americans doing the exact opposite? They gathered more intelligence. Rumors filtered in about turbine engines failing in American deserts, crews struggling with computerized diagnostics, maintenance costs spiraling upward. Each story painted the Abrams prototype as a fragile hangar queen, more suited to demonstrations than warfare. But underneath the Soviet confidence, a sliver of unease took root. Not fear, but curiosity. Why would the richest, most technologically capable nation on Earth choose a design philosophy that seemed so self-destructive? Was it arrogance? A lack of battlefield understanding? A miscalculation by their famously chaotic military-industrial complex. Or worse, was it deliberate? Some Soviet analysts whispered that the XM-1 might be a bluff, a psychological operation meant to draw the USSR into wasting money. Others speculated that the Americans had discovered a new battlefield factor the Soviets simply didn't yet understand. But those voices were drowned out by the overwhelming consensus. The XM-1 was too heavy, too thirsty, too complicated. The Americans had built another expensive toy. And so the Soviet machine moved on with its plans, assembling thousands of T-72s and T-80s, refining deep battle doctrines, preparing for the decisive armored thrust across Europe. All the while, across the ocean, the Americans were quietly perfecting a weapon that the Soviets believed was doomed from birth. While Soviet analysts confidently filed reports mocking the Abrams as a technological diva, something very different was happening on the other side of the world. In the dusty proving grounds of Aberdeen and the sunburned ranges of Fort Knox, American engineers and tank crews were forging a machine unlike anything the Soviets had prepared for. The XM-1 wasn't being built to match the T-72 on Soviet terms, it was being built to rewrite the terms entirely. The first revelation lay in the armor. The Soviets had assumed the Americans were simply layering expensive steel plates in a spaced configuration. Not efficient, not revolutionary, just heavy. But what those men in Moscow never saw on their stolen schematics was the heart of the Abrams. A composite matrix born from a British breakthrough known informally as Chobham armor. This armor wasn't the traditional steel wall the Soviets expected. It was an engineered labyrinth of ceramics, composites, and metals, designed to twist, break, and bleed the energy out of incoming rounds. Soviet long-rod penetrators that would punch through hundreds of millimeters of rolled steel simply shattered or lost coherence against this new material. Shape-charged jets dispersed and died inside its layered geometry. The Abrams wasn't just armored, it was resilient in a way the Soviet design philosophy had never contemplated. Then there was the engine, the infamous gas turbine. Yes, it drank fuel like a thirsty desert wanderer, but in return it offered something no diesel could match. Silence at idle, terrifying acceleration, and instantaneous power. A 60-ton Abrams could lurch from stillness to combat speed in seconds, crest a ridge, fire, and disappear before a Soviet round had even completed its flight arc. The Soviets had mocked the turbine as a logistical nightmare. The Americans saw it as the key to battlefield tempo. But the true revolution was hidden behind glass optics and silicon wafers. Where Soviet tanks relied on optics and crude IR spotlights that spilled their position across the night, the Abrams carried a passive thermal sight, a device that could read heat signatures through smoke, darkness, and even sandstorms. This was paired with a ballistic computer that accounted for wind, barrel wear, ammunition temperature, and range, all in fractions of a second. The Soviets saw delicate electronics. The Americans saw hunting instincts. Inside the Abrams, the commander and gunner operated like two halves of the same predator, one finding targets, the other killing them with machine-like precision. The Soviets had expected a brawl. The Americans were preparing for an execution. The clash that would expose the truth about the Abrams didn't happen in the forests of Europe, the battlefield both superpowers had spent decades preparing for. Instead, fate chose a wasteland of scorching winds and shifting sand. Southern Iraq, 1991. The Iraqi Republican Guard, trained in Soviet doctrine and equipped with export model T-72s, was no ragtag militia. They were battle-hardened after years of war with Iran, confident in their defenses, and deeply familiar with the Soviet style of armored warfare. Ambush lines, massed fire, shock breakthroughs. In their minds, they understood mechanized battle as well as anyone in the world. On the night of February 26th, a sandstorm, one of the region's brutal shambles, rolled across the desert, smothering visibility to nearly nothing. It was the kind of night when infrared spotlights turned into useless halos and tank crews trusted their ears more than their eyes. To the Iraqi T-72 crews, the storm was a blessing. Their active night vision systems were already primitive, barely adequate in clear weather and almost worthless now. But they also believed that nothing else could see either. No tank could maneuver in such blindness, let alone fight. So they sat still, engines idling, hatches closed, confident that the Shamal itself was their greatest ally. But miles away, the Abrams crews of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment saw a very different picture. Their thermal sights cut through the sand as if it were morning fog. In their viewing screens, the desert glowed with ghostly clarity. The hot engines of dug-in T-72s stood out like bright lanterns in the dark. The Iraqis never stood a chance. The first hit came with no warning, just a flash that lit the storm like lightning. A T-72's turret launched skyward as if torn off by invisible hands. A second tank followed, then a third. The American gunners worked with calm, almost eerie rhythm. Laser. Range locked. Fire. Target down. Next. Not one Abrams sat exposed. They struck from standoff distances the Iraqis couldn't match, couldn't see, and couldn't even conceptualize. The T-72 crews fired blindly into the storm, aiming at sounds, shadows, guesses. Their shots fell nowhere near the Abrams line. In the engagement that would be immortalized as 73 Easting, 9 American tanks erased an entire Iraqi armored battalion in under half an hour. Not a single Abrams was destroyed. Not one was even disabled. And no Abrams crewman died to enemy tank fire. The Soviet dream of armored supremacy evaporated in that storm. Doctrines polished for decades shattered in minutes. The myth of the fragile American tank died that night, burning quietly in the desert sands of Kuwait. In the weeks after 73 Easting, the battlefield reports moved faster than politics. Iraqi armored brigades, built on Soviet doctrine, equipped with Soviet machines, trained by Soviet advisors, were not just defeated. They were erased. And as those numbers filtered back to Moscow, they struck harder than any shell ever could. The Soviet High Command had spent years convincing itself that the Abrams was a paper beast. The turbine was supposed to be its downfall. The electronics were supposed to break at the first sign of real fighting. The weight was supposed to doom it in mud or sand. Every assumption the USSR had baked into its war planning, every confident laugh, every dismissive report, collapsed under one brutal statistic: thousands of Iraqi tanks destroyed. 0 Abrams lost to enemy tank fire. That gap wasn't just wide. It was humiliating. Soviet intelligence scrambled to reinterpret the data. They reviewed thermal images, radio transcripts, fragments of depleted uranium darts recovered from wrecked T-72s. They dissected everything, looking for a loophole, some explanation that didn't involve admitting the terrifying truth. The Americans hadn't built a tank. They had built a system. The Soviets had chased mass. More tanks, more factories, more crews, believing that quantity would always crush quality. But Desert Storm exposed the flaw no one in that 1978 briefing room had considered. Mass means nothing if the first shot is always fatal and always delivered by the enemy. The T-72's autoloader, once hailed as a clever reduction in manpower, now revealed its darkest consequence. Ammunition stored beneath the crew turned the tank into a pressure cooker. A single penetrator meant instant death and a turret launched skyward. Meanwhile, the Abrams armored bustle rack isolated its ammunition behind blast doors. Crews survived hits that would have killed any Soviet tank team. Even more damning was the philosophy behind the machines. The USSR had designed tanks around expendable conscripts. The US had designed the Abrams around professionals whose survival mattered as much as victory itself. One military advisor in Moscow reportedly muttered, after reviewing footage of the battle, "We built tanks for a world that no longer exists." In the end, the Abrams didn't merely outperform the T-72, it invalidated the entire Soviet framework for mechanized warfare. A doctrine based on overwhelming numbers had been defeated by a doctrine based on overwhelming information. A battlefield once ruled by mass had become a battlefield ruled by vision. And in that shift, from steel to sensors, from armor to awareness, the old Soviet dream finally died.